18 years since the 9/11 attacks, US presidents have waged unchecked and seemingly endless wars around the world. Will Congress now take back its power to declare war, or will it stand by as the bombs continue to drop? Hello and welcome to Bigger Than Five with me, Rida Fakhri. 18 years ago this week, the US Congress passed a resolution giving the American president what some are now calling a blank check to wage war. The 2001 Authorization for Use of Military Force, or AUMF, empowered the president to use all necessary and appropriate force against the perpetrators of the 9/11 attacks and those who harbored them. The intended targets were Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, yet those 60 words have been used by Presidents Bush, Obama and Trump to justify military operations against so-called associated forces, including ISIS, which did not exist on 9/11. All this without debate by Congress, the legislative branch that was granted the power to declare war by the US Constitution. Since then, 3 successive presidents have led the US into more than 40 combat operations in almost 20 countries, according to the Congressional Research Service. Pakistan is one of them, and that is where we begin.
دا خو 2004 نه شیری شولې سوکا وال خو په غرینه کې وې نه بیا بل ورته کورینه ته که نه مکانینه ته راغللې خبرې په کور کې و مکان و پاک کور و پاک و بال بچ و پاک و بچیون وي بس دا خبرې نه وې پکې چې دا بېګناه دی دا ګننګور دی بس ناچاپه ډرون راغی هغه ما نه شاید مثال وویشت ډرایوینګ مې کړی ډی خان ته راغلی و بیا ډی خان ته مو ته پته راغله چې ته کوره ته راشه داس خو مثال ډایرکټ راته ونه ویل چې داس کیسه ده خو وایي چې ته راشه کوره
29 جون 2010 که نه نو ناڅاپه آواز شولو مونږ خپل هم داسې د ډېرې یېرې د وجې که نه غوږونه مو بند کړل په دغه ځای کې به د موقع باندې که نه او سترګې مو پټې کړل صرف مو دا وکړل چې یا الله خیر که نه چې مطلب دا څه روان شول نو کله چې دغه کور ولګېدلو د هغې دغه لوګی دا هر شي دا ما په د خپلې سترګې باندې لیدل دي که نه
دا یې لورې اورته دی دا وینې داسې دی
میزایل دلته لګېدلی و که نه دوی جونه دوی جیب سترګې دی او دوی جیب سترګې
خوري شو ځنې په دره ګولۍ ووتې ځنې ورسره کوټ ړنګ که نه خوا چې بیا ورغلمه بس دای مې خالي ولیده چې بدن یې سوی و نه سیرت نه دی دا یې په اور لمبې باندې سوی و بیا ما نه پېژندګالۍ مې داسې نه شوه کړه خو چې بیا ما راوړ یوه رنجه یو شي باندې مې مخ ور څپا کړ بیا ما ته پته ولګېده چې دا خو تا ول بچی دی دلته دیاړي کوله خیر دا یا خو اوس چا وشوله خو په ده باندې وشوه نور ژوندي مړه شول که نه چې حکیم ژوندی وي مور یې وه خور یې وه ورور یې وه بس هم منټل حالت کې راغلی چا نظر کې پر خو راغی څوک څرنګه دي څوک داسې
دی خو ما درته وویل چې دا یو narrative of society کې که نه چې کله به هم ډرموټ ویل چې we hated terrorists never they claimed that we hated civilians نو مونږ ته په دې حواله باندې نه ګورنمنټ چې کوم دی د US ګورنمنټ نه پاکستان ګورنمنټ هېڅ قسمه داسې نه ډاکومنټس یا څه داسې اپالوجي لیټر هېڅ قسمه داسې شی نشته
میش خپل غربت الان کې میش دګایز دی وګه خپل دمره د ماړې په غا کې وی که نه د غربت په وجه چې میش په دغه کې وکړه سوچ فکر نه و چې دا دولت ته داسې سوق دی بیا داسې ټیپک خلق دی بیا داسې دهشتګردي دو داسې کیسې دي صرف د غربت د وجې نه یې خپله مزدیره کړله په هغه کې بس دی په دغه رنګه وشو
Drone strikes in Pakistan peaked under President Obama with over 120 strikes estimated in 2010 alone. President Trump has increasingly turned his AUMF authority toward a new frontier, Africa. Since he took office, he's launched 4 times more drone strikes on Somalia than President Obama did in his 8 years in office. So with this surge in military engagement across Africa, has President Trump gone beyond the scope of the 2001 AUMF? I'm joined by retired General Carter Ham, who led U.S. Africa Command Africom under President Obama from 2011 to 2013. General Ham, so is there any doubt in your mind that with this increasing U.S. military presence across Africa, that President Trump has indeed gone well beyond the intended original scope of the 2001 AUMF?
I wouldn't agree with that. First of all, I don't think there is an expanded U.S. military presence in Africa. I'm not current anymore. I don't have the specific numbers, but I believe the physical presence on the African continent is probably, U.S. military, is probably somewhat less than it was previously. And so I don't think that that's quite the right context to say it's a larger effort.
Well, Africom has reportedly 14, quote, forward operating sites, read in layman's terms, military bases. But would you accept that the 2001 AUMF authorized force against a very specific target at the time? Clearly, Africa does not fall under this limited scope, does it?
My understanding, was former military officer, not a former lawyer, but my understanding is that the authorization of the use of military force, which was approved shortly after the attacks of September 11, 2001, was not geographically limited, but was limited in purpose. And so certainly in my experience in the strikes that we conducted when I was at United States Africa Command in Somalia and elsewhere, were determined to be consistent with the authorization for the use of military force. And in Somalia particularly because of the professed relationship between Al-Shabaab, a Somali-based terrorist organization, but their affiliation, their subordination with their alignment with Al-Qaeda.
Wouldn't you agree that several U.S. presidents, in fact all 3 of them, President Bush, President Obama, and President Trump, have overstretched the meaning and the interpretation of this AUMF to go after all these extremist groups, as you mentioned, Al-Shabaab and others?
I don't agree that it's an overstretching of the authorization. That, in my experience, the process, the determination of whether to conduct a strike or not goes through a very rigorous not only operational review and policy review, but a legal review as well.
But leaving the legal considerations aside, according to the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, in the first 2 years of the Trump presidency, there have been more than 2,200 drone strikes compared to about 1,800 strikes during Obama's 8 years in office. Are you at all concerned that these strikes may in fact be contributing to an increased level of instability in the region and in fact serving as very powerful recruitment tools for the groups, the extremist groups that you are taking on and fighting on the continent?
It is a very delicate balance. There have been certainly in some cases some negative consequences of strikes, but there have also been very, very positive outcomes of some of those strikes, and that being that some individuals who planned for, some had participated in attacks against Americans, American interests, were struck and killed in those attacks. So there's
also been a lot of civilian casualties.
There have been civilian casualties. I can only tell you from my experience that process, very rigorous process, viewed through the very senior leaders, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, and others. One of the factors that they look at is what is the likelihood of non-combatant casualties. And it's a very serious consideration that is weighed in the decision-making process.
We also know that these rules of engagement have also been significantly loosened under President Trump. Are you concerned at all that there may be an increasing number of civilians that are killed as a result of these drone strikes?
I don't know the facts because I'm no longer privy to that information, but clearly the number of strikes, looking just at Somalia, the number of strikes over the past few years has increased quite significantly.
But doesn't the authority to launch wars, to authorize wars and limit wars rest squarely within the American Congress. Article 1 of the Constitution stipulates as much.
Again, I'm not a constitutional
What would
lawyer,
you-
but I
what
would
would you
say that
say on this?
Article 2 would give the president as commander-in-chief broad authority as well. And so there is, I
But
think
I
that,
suppose the question is, has the AUMF been misused, and does it have the potential of being misused in the future?
the potential, I suppose, is always there. I think I would argue that that at least from a military standpoint, the authorization has not been misused. But I understand why some people would reflect that point of view, and that's why I think it is important for both branches, for the executive and the legislative, to come together. I do believe it is time for a re-scoping of that authorization, simply because the conditions in 2019 are so vastly different than they were on September 18th of 2001.
But so does that mean that you agree with President Trump's decision to commit U.S. military forces to the Saudi-led war effort in Yemen?
I think the support for our allies and partners is an important consideration. We don't want to severely limit the president in his role as commander-in-chief, but yet the Congress certainly has an important role to play in that well.
Is it, though, in the U.S.'s interest to help the Saudis and their allies in their bombing campaign in Yemen?
So we have seen certainly some, what I would view from a military standpoint, some missteps by the Saudis in Yemen. Certainly Iran has not been helpful in that regard either. So I think there is...
We're talking about more than 50,000 people killed, tens of millions in need of humanitarian aid. Surely that counts as more than just a simple misstep, doesn't it?
Well, I think the role of the United States in supporting the Saudis, and you could play this with others, and the support that we provide should never be open-ended. It should be the opportunity for the United States to say our support is conditional upon good behavior, upon you trying to operate within the laws of warfare to make sure that proportional force is used, that measures are taken to prevent non-combatants, and I think that those are long-standing principles by which the U.S. military has operated, and we should, in my view, make sure that those that we support are abiding by those same principles.
And so, considering the situation as it stands, when you think about the young American soldiers going to war for the United States, many of whom were not even born on 9/11, are you concerned at all that they may be fighting not just an endless war, but a losing war as well?
It certainly is a concern to say, what is the expected outcome? And certainly we've learned in this campaign against terrorist organizations, there isn't a date which you can say, okay, this war is now over and we're victorious. It is going to be generational. It's going to be enduring. To the specific point about the authorization for the use of military force, I think it would be worthwhile to revisit that and say, is it time for a re-scoping, a revisiting of that authority to make sure that the policies under which the U.S. military is operating overseas is in fact consistent with the direction from the President and the authorization from the Congress.
Should it be repealed?
It should be revisited, I think, and perhaps restructured and rescoped more than repealed.
General Carter Ham, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
There have been several attempts by Congress to take back its authority, but they continue to be unsuccessful. In a significant shift this summer, though, the House of Representatives, which is controlled by Democrats, voted to repeal the 2001 AUMF. The bill is unlikely to pass in the Republican-led Senate, but the AUMF has been challenged in other ways. Here's how one U.S. Army intelligence officer took on his commander-in-chief.
I certainly think that ISIS probably constitutes one of the most reprehensible, disgusting ideologies in the world at that time. My issue was with the way in which the mission was not authorized per our system of government and our Constitution. I felt it was in violation of my oath as an officer, as a U.S. Army officer, because Congress had never voted on that mission. They had never passed an AUMF.
We will destroy ISIL and any other organization that tries to harm us.
And so I felt like the president, in acting unilaterally to deploy troops, was essentially acting illegally. So I felt like I needed to challenge that because first and foremost, my obligation is to the American system of government and to my oath as an officer. It has nothing to do with political ideology. It has to do with principle and where do we want to be as a people? Do we want to be faithful to the tenets of the Constitution that our founders put forth that is supposed to be a constitution of peace where going to war is hard and where a majority of our representatives have to vote on it? And it's not one person, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican, who just decides one day willy-nilly that they're going to send troops into harm's way and put people of other countries in harm's way. Hopefully that what this case did was awaken some of the American people to the disgusting nature in which their congressional representatives have been dodging war votes for the last 10, 15 years. So we as a society need to start imposing political consequences on our representatives for failing in their duties and for, frankly, stabbing their own troops in the back.
So then, is Congress stabbing its troops in the back by abdicating its power to authorize and limit war? I'm joined by Stephen Miles, Executive Director of Win Without War, and Michael O'Hanlon, Senior Fellow in Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution. Stephen Miles, so does Captain Nathan Smith then have a strong point? Should Congress be held accountable? Should it retake its war powers responsibilities from the president?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think Captain Smith is absolutely right, and I think we all owe him a big thank you for what he tried to do, which was force Congress, after nearly 2 decades of failing to do its most basic duty, to debate and vote on whether and where and when we go to war. They haven't done it. And Captain Smith was trying to force the question. We need Congress to pick up where his lawsuit left off. We need them to take these issues up again. And we need to have the public debate that we've been denied for far too long.
But what are the chances? As you know, the Senate is firmly controlled by the president's party, the Republican Party.
Yeah, this is really the interesting thing. This comes up a lot when we talk about it. People say kind of, well, maybe nothing will pass. I think it's really important to understand the history. This is why the power to make war was put into Congress's hands and not into the president's hands. When the framers were putting the Constitution together, they knew firsthand what it was like to have kings and queens deciding when and where they went to war. They didn't want to put that kind of power in one person's hand. They wanted it to be hard. They wanted it to be difficult. So they put it in Congress.
Michael O'Hanlon, fair point. It was never supposed to be easy, nor was war supposed to be in the hands of just one person.
Yeah, Steve makes great points, but I would just add a cautionary note without disagreeing. But I would just say a lot of the ideas you hear for how to replace the 2001 AUMF could actually do net harm. Because some of the ideas that have been floated in recent years, for example, have set an arbitrary time limit on how much longer we could continue hostilities. It's not always about geographic expansion. Sometimes it's about the core anti-Al-Qaeda mission, even in the place from which Al-Qaeda came in the first place.
But are you suggesting there should be no time limits, no geographic limits?
I'm suggesting that if you write a firm time limitation into a law, which once it expires, then denies authority overnight, and we're going to count on our Congress to actually have done something decisive by that point so as not to leave us in a vacuum, that could do more harm than good.
Do you agree? Would that do more harm than good, or would it perpetuate these endless wars that the United States has been waging?
Yeah, I think this is a point on which we disagree. I think it wouldn't do more harm than good. I think it might be disruptive to the mission, but that's kind of the point, right? The point is that these things are supposed to be debated. And if 435 members of Congress, another 100 in the Senate, if they can't come together and reach a consensus about what we should be doing, we ought not to do that. We are asking young men and women to go off and to fight and to die in these wars. We are killing other people in these wars. We can't pretend that's not happening. And if Congress can't muster the basic political courage to do its job, then how on earth can we as a country ask other people to put their lives on the line?
You're also asking 80% of members of Congress who did not vote for this war authorization to carry on with it.
Yeah, just a couple of things, though. First of all, of course, Congress is providing some degree of oversight with the annual budget process. I agree that's not the same thing as making a clear-cut decision in the first place, but it's something. Second, quite often what people are frustrated by with the current AUMF is the longevity. Not so much the geographic expansion. Now, people will complain about both, but sometimes Al-Qaeda does pop up in Libya or an affiliate in Somalia or somewhere else. And so the original legislation as written is applicable. Now, you could say, wouldn't it be nice if we could at least update it every 18 years? I grant that point.
You say it's applicable, but it's also open to very broad interpretation.
Right, and so I would like a better law, for example, that required, let's say, the Director of National Intelligence to certify that a given target has enough in common with the ideology and the leadership of the original Al-Qaeda that it would be a target that could be attacked under the 2001 legislation or the updated version. That kind of an update, I think, would be fine.
Stephen Miles, would that be fine? I mean, was that the original intent of Congress when it voted for the 2001 AUMF? I mean, just last month, the U.S. State Department's legal advisor, Merrick Strang, testified at a Senate hearing. This is what he said. He said that any new AUMF should have no sunset provision, no time limitation, no geographic limitation, and no repeal before replacement. I mean, isn't this further proof that the Trump administration is seeking to expand the scope of the original AUMF well beyond its intent?
18 years ago, what were those members of Congress voting on? They were voting within days. You know, the smoldering ruins of the Pentagon and the Twin Towers were still there. This was fresh, this was raw, and ask any member of Congress who took that vote, and they will tell you they were voting about what happened on 9/11. But no one in their right mind thought when they were taking a vote 3 days after the attacks of 9/11, that they were 18 years later going to be given an administration an argument that they could use to try to make war against Iran, which is what the State Department was talking about.
And that is the concern. As you know, Michael O'Hanlon, there is an increasing number of members of Congress, Democrats, who are concerned that the US president might use the AUMF to justify war. In fact, that is perhaps partly the reason why they voted in favor of repealing the AUMF. Yeah. It is sending that clear message to the president that you cannot wage war against Iran without our authority.
I think that
and
would
yet
be
you
good.
say that there should be a new AUMF. Isn't that recipe for further misuse by the president?
Right. I would worry that the current AUMF could be bent or severely contorted to justify war against Iran, which for all of its failings as a government was not behind the 9/11 attacks and is not an actual collaborator of Al-Qaeda. Yes, there have been occasional Al-Qaeda people found with Iranian presence here or there. Also, I could worry that a president might even try to use this for justification with war against North Korea.
Well, on the point of Iran, as you know, the president did, his administration has promoted the theory of links between Al-Qaeda and Iran and has also listed the Revolutionary Guards on the terrorism list. Isn't that perhaps something that suggests that the administration, may be inching toward a justification for war against Iran?
Yeah, that's why I'm with Steve, to the extent that I can imagine legislation that would be better than where we are now. Because I would like to tighten things up such that war against Iran, war against North Korea, those kinds of things would not be considered. Also, it would be nice just to certify that people acknowledge that the war against Libya was actually not justified by the AUMF. The Obama administration used a different argument that most people have concerns about, but nonetheless, we should explicitly agree. And we should also explicitly agree the invasion of Iraq was not justified or justifiable based on the 2001. It got its own vote and its own legislation. So if we can remind ourselves, refresh these debates, I agree with Steve, 18 years is too long to go on autopilot. So on that point, I'm completely in accord.
It brings into question the broad interpretation of the 2001 AUMF that has also been used to justify the detention at Guantanamo Bay of those U.S. suspects under its counterterrorism efforts without charge for the most part. Isn't that, Michael O'Hanlon, to you, a clear misuse of the 2001 authorization?
I prefer to detain people rather than kill them, not just because I try to be a nice guy, but because detainees can provide information. So my issues with Guantanamo...
But they haven't been charged.
My issues with Guantanamo Bay...
They're being held without charge.
In some cases, I'm okay with that. But I'm not okay with using Guantanamo Bay. I've never been happy about the logic of essentially sitting on a piece of sovereign territory of some other country and finding that as a legal way around our habeas corpus and other legal requirements. If you're going to hold without charge, just admit you're doing it for reasons that have to do with wartime emergencies rather than trying to find this cute solution extraterritorially.
Stephen Miles, do you agree with this? Should the U.S. be allowed to detain people without charge?
Well, I think it's part and parcel of the larger question. And this is why having an endless war authorization out there, being in this kind of constant state of legal war, is dangerous. Look, war is supposed to be a temporary state. You know, William Tecumseh Sherman, the famous general, once said, war is hell. It is a different state of affairs than what is normal. That is supposed to be the way our legal structures work. And so when you are engaged in war, when you have a war legal framework out there, the expectation, and the Supreme Court has said this in these decisions, is things are a little different. We look at this a little different because this is not the normal, this is the extraordinary, this is war. But the problem is now that legal state of affairs has become normal. So until we change that framework, until we begin to recognize we can't continue under this status quo, we're going to have questions like Guantanamo, we're going to have questions like the AUMF being on the books, we're going to have all of these unanswered questions. There's a really simple solution, and that's to repeal the AUMF and begin to do their job as members of Congress.
Stephen Miles and Michael O'Hanlon, thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you.
So while few people here expect Congress to revoke the AUMF, a growing number of Democrats are concerned that it could be used to drag the US into new unauthorized wars. But with his party firmly in control of the Senate, the president's authority to use military force across the Middle East and Africa will likely continue unchallenged, at least for now. From me, Rida Fakhri, and all the team here in Washington, thanks for watching. See you next week.